All right, so we are going to wrap up lecture series number 5 by just discussing so-called software licensing and different business models that are typically associated with licensing. I think this is going to be some sort of revision, seeing as this is, to the best of my knowledge, is supposed to be covered in depth in EDU 1020. I'm not sure if this has already been done, but it's also discussed here as well. Just to tie the different pieces together. All right, so we're just going to focus our brief discussion on different software business models that are out there, and a chart on copyright and licensing associated with software. All right, so it turns out that there are a number of business models associated with software, and really these are generally based on a specific target group that that piece of software will be associated with. These are generally categorized, the different models of software generally categorized as being vertical software or horizontal software. So the vertical software tools would be, or software applications would be software applications that are implemented for a specific domain, right? So think of accounting packages, for instance, that would generally be meant to be used by accountants, for instance, right? Or things like learning management systems like Moodle. That's a piece of software that's specific to institutions of higher learning, or educational institutions rather, not institutions of higher learning, because Moodle could pretty much be used in, I guess, a high school setting as well. And then horizontal software would be software that is generally targeted towards a broad spectrum of end users, right? So these would be really generic applications like word processors, for instance. The average computer system user will at some point use a word processor like Microsoft Word or Google Docs, right? Just because everybody has to write something at some point in time, right? A web browser would be an example of horizontal software as well. All right, and so in terms of licensing and copyright, I guess a couple of things worth mentioning here is this misconception that people normally have with regards to software, with regards to licensing and copyright. Licensing will generally dictate what you are allowed to do with the piece of software once you download it, right? And the copyright will outline who owns that piece of software, right? So if you develop a piece of software, generally the copyright would be under your name, but you'd be free to decide what sort of license you want to associate or attach to that piece of software. If you want it to be open source, then you'd have to target a particular type of license that allows, or that would allow that piece of software to be shared under that sort of licensing scheme. So common license examples would be like MIT, for instance, or BSD licenses, for instance, or GPL version 2 these days. All right, so but the idea behind licensing here is it turns out that when you're writing software, what you're doing is you're creating value, right? And at the same time using up your time, right? And so it's usually the case that you want to derive some sort of intrinsic value from that piece of software, right? Some people will probably sell the rights to the software. Some people would produce a software and have people subscribe or make some sort of monthly or annual subscription to the piece of software, so that there's a bit of money that is obtained from that. So some people have altruistic motives and we just create some piece of software and just share it with the rest of the world or the general public for free, and even better, share the corresponding source code associated with that piece of software. And that's when open license actually kicks in here, because what you're doing really is not just sharing the piece of software, but rather also sharing the original source code. Now, the beauty or the advantage of sharing the original source code is that other people would be able to make enhancements to that piece of software and be able to generate or produce even better variations of that piece of software. And in fact, this is how more mainstream pieces of software like Android OS came into the scene, right? If you remember, we at some point made mention of the fact that Android traces its origin from Unix. The reason we've been able to get up to Android is simply because Unix is open source, right? The reason why there are applications such as so-called LibreOffice Writer, which is a word processor, is because OpenOffice, the OpenOffice was released under an open source license, right? And so a group of programmers came together and created a fork of OpenOffice to actually derive or create LibreOffice. All right. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. In terms of the broad categories associated with or rights associated with licensing here, notice that you can look at them as being or as falling under this spectrum associated with the rights that one would have access to. So on the extreme left, you'd have licenses that will allow individuals or the public to actually have more rights, and on the far right, you have more restrictive licenses, right? So you have different groups, right, of software. You have commercial software, which is generally copyrighted and developed for profit, explicitly for profit. So think of this Adobe suite of applications that people normally use for video editing, for instance. For you to be able to use those applications, you probably need to buy a license, right? And I know most people are probably thinking, well, what about looking for key generators or cracks, right? Cracked versions of the software. Well, that's illegal, right? It's not right. And there are people that have been prosecuted because of that, right? So commercial software, and there's usually an explicit end user agreement that you have to agree to. Typically, the part that you go through as you're installing software, say, agree to this license, and I know the vast majority of people probably just click I agree without reading, but it turns out that that's very important. There's usually fine print indicated in there that will explicitly indicate what might potentially happen to you if you illegally share copies of the software that you have access to. You also have so-called shareware, right? Now, this would be software that is copyrighted but made freely available for end users to use, right? And generally what typically happens with shareware in certain instances is you're given a trial period within which you can use that piece of software, after which you'd have no access to it. And I think I have an example of oh my god, what diagramming tool was I using? There's so I have a piece of software I was working with called I hope this is the one, Wireframe Sketcher, right? And I only had, I think, about a month to try to actually play around with this piece of software, after which I could still use this piece of software, but the output that I was exporting had a watermark. Not a watermark, actually. I probably would not be able to export this or something. But anyway, bottom line here is that you typically have a trial associated with these types of software tools. And then you also have freeware, right? This would be software that is copyrighted quite all right. The original authors of the software will retain copyright access to the software, but it's made available for free for end users to use. Now, in certain instances, it could mean that the source code to the software is not made publicly available, right? So you can download the application and install it on your computer system, be able to use it, but you won't have access to the source code. Then you have open source software, right? So this would in which the original source code is made freely available, right? But the interesting thing is that piece of software may sometimes not be freely available for you to use, right? But because you have access to the source code, you can make derivations of the software and make forks and create new versions of that piece of software. And then there's a so-called free and open source software, right? So it's, I guess, an improvement from open source software. So this would be software that is available for free. And in addition, the source code is also available for the general public to freely use. Right? All right, and then on the extreme end, you have software that will generally be just made available in the public domain. So no copyright is owned by anybody here. So it's just available for the public to consume as they wish. But something worth mentioning here in closing is that probably very to do with types of licensing associated with software, but more like the business model associated with software. Increasingly here, especially when it comes to mobile applications, the way in which people tend to make money is through so-called in-app purchases. So the piece of software will be made freely available for people to download, but for you to use additional features associated with that piece of software, you would have to make a little payment, right? This is very common for gaming applications, for instance, where you install the application, but for you to get, let's say, additional firepower or ammunition, you have to pay money. In the past, I've found myself obsessing with certain funny games where I've literally paid money for me to transition to the next level, for instance. World of Goo, I think, is one of those stupid applications that I've wasted money on. All right. So in closing here, just to give us a little bit of homework. This has become somewhat of a tradition. Every year there's this homework that's given out. I'd like for us to go through the so-called GNU manifesto, right? And maybe at some point we could have a discussion about this manifesto in one of these live question and answer sessions to see what your thoughts are on this. All right, so to recap on this particular lecture series, we just briefly glossed over some business models associated with software, computer software, and also briefly looked at the different licensing models associated with software. Again, just wanted to, in closing, just to mention that there's a fundamental difference between copyright and licensing. Copyright specifies who owns the software. Licensing outlines what you're allowed to do with the software. All right, so that brings us to the end of lecture series number 5. We've covered quite a bit. We started off our discussion by looking at fundamental differences associated with hardware and software, and then we looked at the different categories and subcategories of software, so application software and system software. And then we also gained an appreciation of how a computer program gets to be executed, and then we finally wrapped up by looking at different software licensing models that are available out there. All right, so just to mention that at some stage, I think a very mini lab will be set up, right, with instructions. Hopefully we can work through that. The plan is to try and cover out this so-called lab-like interaction so that it uses Android, because we would like to think that the vast majority of people in class have access to an Android-powered device. So be on the lookout for that. And if you have any questions, please use the mailing list. You don't have to wait until we have our next scheduled live interaction. I do encourage us to send questions through the mailing list. All right, so just a few resources in the bibliography here. I also share additional resources via the Moodle, right, to help us explore all these broad topics that we looked at, the broad units that we looked at. All right, great. Thanks a lot, and please take care. Thank you.